So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this special event. My name is Hwan-Soo Kim and I teach Korean religion and culture in the Department of Religious Studies. I also serve as chair of the Council on East Asian Studies. It is my tremendous honor to host this event for two prominent scholars of East Asian history, politics, and culture. The central theme of today's conversation is, what is Korea? Of course, Korea has not existed in isolation, and thus the more specific question is, how has Korea preserved its political and cultural identity throughout the 5,000 years of its tumultuous history? An identity that it has shared, negotiated, and contested with those of its neighboring countries, China and Japan, and beyond. Professor Myung-Tul Yoon will give two talks, one today and the other this Friday, to shed some light on this subject. And to make our conversations more relevant to modern and contemporary international relations, Professor Ani Westad from the Department of History here at Yale is kindly joining us to share reflections from his most and highly acclaimed book called Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China and Korea Relations, which is also translated into Korean. So these three talks combined, luckily for us, will span the entire 5,000 years of Korean history and enlighten us on the distinctive and common characteristics of Korean identity in the regional and global context. These talks will also illuminate the precarious conditions on the Korean Peninsula in the face of a Beijing-centric order and the increasing assertiveness of Korea with its international influence. So today's event will be divided into two parts. Professor Westad will first speak for 30 minutes about his book, followed by Professor Yoon. Professor Yoon's presentation will be translated by my dear colleague, Professor Jun An from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much. He's a professor of Korean studies, so he's joining us especially for this purpose. After the two presentations, our speakers will have the opportunity to ask questions of each other, and we will then open the floor for your questions from the audience. In the interest of time, and due to the video recording of today's event, I would ask that you write your questions on the note cards being distributed, and I'll be reading later on after collecting them. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers. Dr. Myung-Tul Yoon is a professor emeritus of history at Dongguk University and is currently professor of archaeology at Samarkand State University of Uzbekistan. His research focuses on the history of the Goguryeo period from the 1st century BC to the 8th century CE, as well as East Asian maritime history. He's published over 60 books and numerous journal articles. He's also a poet and explorer and has published 14 books of poetry. Professor Ani Westad is a scholar of modern international and global history with a specialization in the history of Eastern Asia from the 18th century on. He studied at the University of Oslo before receiving his graduate degree at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Westad has published 16 books, many articles, and received numerous awards. He taught at the London School of Economics and Harvard History. And you joined Yale 3 years ago?
2019.
Yeah, and Yale snatched him from Harvard. Today's event is supported by Hongnam Kim's Korean Studies Fund, and special thanks go to the council staff, Kathy, and particularly In-jung Kim, without whose logistic help, I would be deeply exhausted and sick in bed. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ani Westad.
So thank you very much, Wansu, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me today to speak together with Professor Yun. I want to hear what he has to say, so I will be relatively brief in presenting my book. And for those of you who are at Yale, you know where to find me, so you can easily seek me out and discuss these things with me. So this is a book that came out of a set of lectures, so-called Raishawa lectures, that I did at Harvard in 2017. And the idea is to try to look at the relationship between China and Korea over a long period of time. Right? And in order to get to some of the essential aspects of that relationship. It has been an ever-changing relationship, as you'll hear me talk about in a minute. But there are some structural aspects of it that seem to me to connect at least the period when I start up, at the beginning of the Ming and the Joseon states, to what has come later. So it is not without relevance when we try to understand today's relationship between a new Chinese state, calls itself the People's Republic of China, and the two Korean states. So history matters, but not always in the manner that we assume. There is no automaticity in this. But people learn from their history. At least they try to learn from their history. Because there isn't all that much more that you can learn from, particularly when you're dealing with neighbors. And in Korea's case, very powerful neighbors to the north and the west and the east as well. You have to learn. And Korea has learned through that long process. The empires learn as well. Though they learn differently. They learn in a different form. So this is where the title of the book comes from. Empire and Righteous Nation. And Professor Yun has the recently published Korean edition, to which I wrote a new preface. So by talking about empire, it wouldn't be that difficult to understand who I have in mind when I speak about empire. I speak about China in its various forms. So we're dealing with several different incarnations of these states, going back to the early Ming era. I'm going to talk a little bit about empire in a minute in more general terms, but it's pretty clear what the title refers to, at least, in terms of empire. Now, righteous and nation are more complicated concepts. And I spend quite a bit of time at the beginning of this book to talk about those concepts. Now, by referring to Korea, again, no surprise, it's Korea I'm referring to when I use the expression righteous nation. As righteous, I don't, of course, mean that every Korean is righteous. Far from it. That is not based on historical evidence. I like Koreans, but not that much that I would call all of them righteous. It would also be unfair. Too much to live up to. What I mean is that concepts of righteousness, yi in Chinese, we in Korean, is something that has played a particular role in Korean history going far back. It is an integral part of the Neo-Confucian Revolution that the early Joseon state signaled and symbolized. And it also became a key aspect, both of trying to understand how Korean society should work, but perhaps more importantly over time, at critical junctures in Korean history, as you will know better than me, as a resistance to foreign domination. So righteousness in this context, of course, has many meanings. But part of it is an appeal to a Korean understanding of the fundamentals of what it means to be Korean, the essence of the discussion that we are going to have today, which of course has varied enormously over time. Right? It is not in any way static. But this concept seems to me to come up again and again in various forms. Now the concept nation is of course also, if you go back to the late 14th century, problematic with regard to Korea. And I'd like us to spend some time, if we have, afterwards, maybe discussing that. As I was writing this book, And I actually wrote most of the book in Beijing when I was visiting there at Peking University. I started thinking very seriously about the use of the concept nation, which of course is a 19th century European invention, right? In order to try to understand Korean history in an earlier time period. If you use this concept within a framework of automaticity, of course it becomes entirely anachronistic. But if you, as Professor Habush and others have done, go to the core of the European romantic concept of nation in terms of how it is defined, then I think it's very hard to avoid the thought that Korea very distinctly in an Eastern Asian context have some of those characteristics already coming out of the beginning or being formed during the beginning of the time period that I'm talking about. And particularly during the Great East Asian War in the late 16th century, as has been noted by many historians that I build on, not least Korean historians. Some of those characteristics of what it meant to be, in a professed, proud way, a nation in Europe in the 19th century also seem to be rather strikingly similar to some, not all, of the concepts that Korean identity builds on during that time. So that's why it's called Empire and Righteous Nation. That's a long explanation for a title, but it is one that really brings you, I think, to the core of what I want to discuss in this book, about what stays relatively intact and what changes over time. So the book has three parts to it. My students, when I was writing it, like to joke that the first part deals with about 500 years of Sino-Korean relations, and the second part deals with maybe 70, 80 years of Sino-Korean relations, and the third part deals with the last 3 weeks of Sino-Korean relations. It's not quite as bad as that, but the first part is very much about the relationship between two empires based in China, the Ming and the Qing, and the Joseon state that both of them had to interact with, going up to the late 19th century. The second part, which I call the internationalization of East Asia, China, Korea, and the world, goes from the 1860s, 1870s up to 1992. And then the third one deals with the period much more recently, and particularly the future of Sino-Korean relations in the 21st century. So that is how the book is constructed. Let me talk just very briefly about each of these three parts before I pass the floor over to Professor Yun. And then perhaps you can talk about some of this afterwards. So I said that both the Ming and Joseon were created in a very similar time period at the end of the 14th century, very much under the influence of the same kinds of ideas about state and the construction of society, the reconstruction of society at the end of the 14th century. In both cases, as historians have shown, you could talk about a Neo-Confucian revolution. It's particularly striking in the Joseon project because of the way the regime, in spite of its own vicissitudes and difficulties with getting established, as many of you will know about, insisted on the Neo-Confucian framework as being the foundation of the state in a very direct, rather concrete way. The Ming, which, by the way, as many of you know, had the same problems with getting the empire, the dynasty, established, also used forms of Neo-Confucian thinking in order to establish that state. I don't have time to go into the differences between the two. There were significant differences, but there were also significant similarities. And one of the trends that I follow then for the 15th and the 16th century especially is how various ideas and concepts on the Korean and on the Chinese side mutually strengthen, reinforce each other during a long-term conversation among Neo-Confucian scholars that go on during those 2 centuries, or at least up to the middle part of the 16th century. I find that hugely interesting because it is one of those cases where you find that there is a culture, and it's right to call this a culture, I think, even though it's more limited than many other forms of culture that we know, where you have people from very different backgrounds speaking different languages, but of course expressing themselves in written form in similar terms, exchanging ideas about how you can build a just and righteous state. And also crucially about how the relationship between the two should work. And that is where the issue that I deal with more than anything else in the first chapter really comes to. Because it is one thing to proclaim Confucian righteousness. It's another thing to try to implement this in the relationship between states. And that's, of course, something that the Sino-Korean relationship has always had trouble with defining. So what I find is that in spite of this flourishing world of exchange of ideas, and for that matter also of goods, that existed between China and Korea, the Joseon insistence on being linked but outside the empire is perhaps the core value that regulates the relationship between the two. And this is important because the Ming in other forms, as many of you will know, and of course the Qing even more that followed it, were expansionist states. Right? It wasn't given from the beginning, particularly with this definition of a common culture, that the Joseon state would necessarily stay outside of these expanding empires, and particularly true for the Qing. So in addition to the principles that both of them based themselves on, there also had to be a lot of practical thinking about how this relationship should actually work and how it should be expressed. Because within the Neo-Confucian framework, again, as many of you will know, how you express things is of incredible significance in terms of how you should understand the reality that you live under in terms of concepts. So the question I asked towards the end of that chapter is how it was possible for a much weaker state, as Joseon definitely was, to keep its independence, and I here deliberately use the modern term independence, when confronted with an empire, with empires that were expansionist and inclusionist in many ways. And my answer to that question is manifold. One, which I think is truly important, is through the principle of always knowing more about the empire than the empire knows about you. That could be a fancy name for intelligence, and it is to some extent, though it goes much wider than intelligence. So the tribute missions that took place to China, to the Ming, and then to the Qing afterwards, were also fantastic opportunities for gathering information about the empire and the empire's intentions. And I would go as far as saying that if it weren't for that, then Joseon would have been much more exposed with regard to China than what was the case in reality, particularly during the transition from Ming to Qing, which, and I don't have time to go into that today, but was of course highly problematic from a Korean point of view. So knowing more about the empire than the empire knows about you is a very important part of all this. The other part is, of course, to show, as Joseon scholars and the Joseon state showed increasingly as you get into the 17th and the 18th century, that you can be better practitioners of Confucianism, of Neo-Confucianism, than what even the empire can be. This is a remarkable time period when we think about it in ideological terms, in the relationship between the Qing and the Joseon. How was it possible for the Joseon kings to get away after the big changeover, and after having confronted and lost against the Qing armies in the early 17th century? Not just to keep its own independence, but keep on venerating long-dead Ming emperors, who of course were the sworn enemies of the Qing dynasty that was now encased in China, and get away with it. And the insistence that what Confucian scholars and the Confucian court, Joseon did in this context, was to practice righteousness with regard to the emperors that had gone before and that had had a relationship to Korea. I call it in the book a vassal relationship. It's hard to find an English term that actually works for this. Because the important thing for me is that Korea is linked to the empire but outside of it. So whatever way you want to express it. They were allowed to go on doing that because of that shared inheritance that even the Qing respected. And that level of even rather contrary Sinocentrism is, of course, then what gets into trouble increasingly towards the end of the 19th century when the Qing itself is receding. It's not that the Joseon elite are particularly fond of the Qing. They are not. But living in a world where the Chinese empire, a Chinese empire that Korea has so long been linked to in one form or another, offers both enormous challenges, maybe first and foremost in the relationship to Japan, but also enormous opportunities for rethinking what kind of state formation that a truly independent Korea should have. Now, that's what then defines the second chapter of the book, because it is in many ways an enforced internationalization of East Asia that takes place during this period. Enforced first and foremost because of Japanese aggression against Korea, and for that matter, against China as well. But also because other countries get into the mix in terms of defining the framework. It's so far removed from what you find in the early 19th century, never mind the 17th and the 18th century. My verdict in the book is that in spite of being occupied, of being colonized, losing its independence to Japan, Korea, and being, suffering the consequences of that, almost immediately in Korea, you have this transition over to new forms of thinking about nation and nationalism coming out of the late 19th century. One could almost go as far as saying that part of the tragedy of Korea in the 20th century was that just as these new concepts of what Korea consisted of came of age, the country was occupied by Japan. So these forms of nationalism all had to grow up in exile. And we know what happens to nationalisms that grow up in exile. They get hypercharged, and they get absolutely convinced that the only version of a future for a country is the version that their particular brand of concept of nation or nationalism consists of. So by saying that, I'm not saying the same thing as some historians have been saying, including some American historians, that the origins of the division of Korea should be sought in those early divergences of Korean nationalism. I don't think that is enough of itself as a causal effect. I mean, the division of Korea came out of the Second World War and the Cold War and the division of the two occupation zones, without any doubt. But what it did was that it fueled the concepts of nation and national aims that then took root both in the South and in the North. It shaped and formed them in ways that are really, really significant. So that is leads up then to the third and final part of the book, where I talk about the relations between China and the two Korean states today. I'm not going to go into that too deeply here. You can read the book. Now, also in Korean, for those who prefer that. But I'm basically saying that much of the current Chinese policy towards the two Korean states is based on some of those principles and ideas that come out of the past, but in a new kind of format. And that new kind of format is definitely based on China's own rise, the PRC's own rise as an economic power over the past generation. Some ideas in that rise have come from Korea, just as some ideas about the organization of Confucian society in the Ming in the 16th century came from Korea. But there are also an increasing, and to me worrisome level within the PRC of developing a form of Chinese nationalism that projects to Korea, to both Koreas and to other countries in the region, a new form of Sinocentrism that go beyond what you saw even during the Ming and probably also the Qing Empire. It is a form of putting China at the center that asks not for linkages and that form of intellectual, cultural inclusion, even under pressure, as happened in the case of the Qing, but in diplomatic and strategic terms, and will punish countries at the borders that do not profess to the same understanding of that centrality, that central role of China, as the current PRC leaders profess to. That worries me. It doesn't, not because of the way some of our American colleagues are saying, oh, this is bringing China back to the way it was during the great dynasties. It's not doing that. It is presenting us with a completely new kind of problem in terms of how China's fantastic rise, an admirable rise, will influence the smaller countries that surround it. Whether that will be a cooperative form or an authoritarian and forced form of cooperation between China and these countries. So that's where I leave it in terms of the book. It's a very brief book, so you might be able to read it in a couple of afternoons if you have an interest in it. I don't write many brief books, so if you want to read a brief book of mine, this might be a good place to start. So that is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now Professor Yun. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Thank you.